What's up and welcome back to another synth video. My name is Miles Away. Now, from the title of this, you might think that I am creating yet another video on the OB-6 for no reason at all. But you'd be surprised, I've been getting a ton of questions recently on whether or not the OB-6 is still worth it, whether or not I still like the OB-6, and whether or not I even still have the OB-6. So I wanted to make this video as an answer to those questions. If you just want to hear my final thoughts and you want to skip the video, here it is. I still think, and this is fully my opinion, the OB-6 from Dave Smith and Tom Oberheim is still the single greatest analog synthesizer that I've ever owned, and it's still my favorite synthesizer in my studio. Other more expensive feature-packed synths have come and gone, but the OB-6 still reigns supreme and still holds that coveted position as the main keyboard controller in the center of my studio. This video is a bit of a throwback and a bit nostalgic because that big video on the OB-6 was my first synth video that did quite well and got me a lot of attention from both viewers and companies alike. So I wanted to kick it back with a video on what I still think is my favorite instrument in my studio, and hopefully this will settle the debate once and for all with all the comments I get. Yes, I still think the OB-6 is worth it. One final note, I'm aware that the OB-6 is an expensive instrument. In fact, they've gone up in price in recent years, and for that reason, it's not reasonable for everybody to get one. It's not a reasonable first instrument for most people. So I highly suggest you check out my video on GeForce Software's Oberheim VSTs. The GeForce ones sound fantastic, and you can do a lot of what I'm talking about in this video with those. Alright, thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Hopefully this settles the debate once and for all, and let's get started. Alright, now every sound you heard in that demo track, except for the drums, was created using only the OB-6 with some added effects. Now, the OB-6 most definitely does need external effects. Let me put that here. I've said it in every video I have. I don't really like the effects on this instrument, except for the chorus and the bucket brigade delay, and of course the analog distortion. With that out of the way, let's jump onto the front panel. I'm not going to do a full tour. I've done that already, but I want to show you a couple reasons why I still think this is just my favorite instrument. Simply put, it's my favorite synthesizer, and I'll hold on to it till the day I die. Alright, so here we are on the front panel of the OB-6. Now, like I mentioned in the intro, I already have a full-length walkthrough of this amazing synthesizer, so I'm not going to be going through each section, and I'm not going to be doing a tutorial. Go watch that video if you haven't already and you want to learn more about how to use the synth. But let's start by initializing a patch so I can show you some of my favorite things about the synth. So, of course, the sound is great to begin with, but ever since they added the vintage mode, which you get to by holding bank and global and then going to number 4, vintage mode on or off, the vintage mode is absolutely game-changing, and really I think the main criticism that people who loved analog vintage synths used to throw at the OB-6 was that it was a bit too modern, a bit too tight, and with the vintage mode, which essentially adds a whole bunch of randomness to a bunch of the different parameters like filter, oscillator, voice detune, envelope time, release, etc. By bringing in the vintage mode, you hear that? This changes the game, and in my humble opinion, in the mix, you're never going to be able to tell the difference between a vintage Oberheim and an OB-6 like this. With the vintage mode all the way up, or actually I like it rather about 60-70% up, the amount of character just on an init saw wave is just breathtaking. If I had to say one of the main reasons why I think the OB-6 works so well for what I do, it's because, as you can hear, the oscillators are extremely bright. Now, some people criticize the OB-6 for being, too bright and not warm enough like an analog synth, but I always prefer to start with a really bright oscillator sound and then filter it down, because we can always get that warmth. Let's bring in a second oscillator here, bring it in as a saw wave, bring in some of that lovely detune, filter up, resonance, half keyboard tracking. I mean, come on. Who is going to say that's not warm? Let's bring in some LFO. Gorgeous, right? So I like starting with this extremely hyper bright sound, because if you don't have bright enough oscillators, you cannot do certain sounds and certain genres of music without a ton of processing in the box. And I think the OB-6 is so versatile, despite the fact that it just has the SEM filter, despite the fact that it doesn't have as much modulation as others. I find myself using this synth in every single genre, whether I'm making, scorching leads and super saws for some sort of EDM banger, or if I'm making really, really atmospheric, cinematic or ambient style music. So the sound character is so perfectly well suited with the power and imperfection of an analog oscillator, but with the brightness that you don't always find in some synths as well. So yeah, absolutely my favorite thing. One final trick I absolutely love: if you still do find that the OB-6 is too bright and doesn't have quite enough retro character, go ahead and hold down effect, and we bring in the included distortion to about 6 or 7. 7's my lucky number here. And then all of a sudden, without it, notice how it's a lot darker all of a sudden. Let's overdo it here. Right, so the distortion acts a little bit as almost like a saturation for the high frequencies. And the more distortion you add, obviously you're going to get clipping and that kind of overdrive effect, which you don't always want. But if you just add a bit of distortion in lightly, it just really adds that sort of buttery, like less bright, more sort of warm and saturated top end that I think people associate when they think of retro type of synthesizers. So that is probably my number one favorite thing about just why the synth sounds so good on every genre. Seriously, it sounds good on everything. But the second thing is the workflow. If you've noticed, I literally can work this synth while talking with my eyes closed, literally. Like it's that straightforward. And I have to say the Prophet 6 and Prophet 5 are just as easy to use. So if your tone preference is more along the sound of a Prophet, I totally respect that, and I could see how the Prophet 6 or 5 would be your forever synth. But for me, I just love the character of the OB-6. And I will say, I like the workflow more on the OB-6 than on the OBX8. That's why this synth sits right here, is because if I'm just in a rush and I'm like, okay, I need to design from scratch. Okay, let's make a small, bass sound, stereo. Make it a little bit wider here. Make it square wave, pulse width, modulation. You can just do stuff so quickly with no menu diving whatsoever, and then the little shortcut of resetting the patch here is great. So I really love producing in a flow state, and I'll probably do a video on that later, but I think that the OB-6 and Prophet 6 and Prophet 5 are by far the most flow state inducing keyboards I've ever used. And then part 3, I think, is the quirks. So if you really want to have a very basic jack of all trades, do it all synthesizer that can work for any genre, yeah, like I said in my Prophet 6 video, I would probably recommend the Prophet 6. But there's a reason why I kept my OB-6, but I sold my Prophet 6, even though I absolutely loved it. And that's because the quirks of the OB-6, just the SEM filter with the variable notch, it's just so unique for such a hands-on instrument. And I know absolutely there's some great plugins that now have this variable sem filter on a polysynth, but at the time of its creation, my understanding is that there really wasn't much out there that really accurately sounded like an analog sem filter on a polysynth. And now, even though there are plugins, we really just, in my opinion, can't quite get this same workflow where you're getting the best of both worlds. You're getting the best of the analog world in terms of hands-on knob per function and just massive sweet spot. And then you're getting the best of something more, a little bit more niche and boutique, like either a weird hardware synth or a quirky plugin where you're getting some weird quirks that can make you have your sound a bit more unique. So if I go ahead, for example, and show you one of my absolute favorite tones, let's go ahead and bring back a similar patch to what we had before, just a sort of classic polysynth. Sawtooth polysynth patch. Well, this time I'll bring some envelope in. Maybe not that quite that much envelope. Oh, that is massive sounding. Let's do our distortion trick again here. Bring in some distortion, bring in some of this, bring in velocity. Like you can just see, I'm just flying on this thing. Bring in a little bit of pan spread. I never really like the pan spread up to full. This sounds a bit cheesy to me unless it's in background part. It's just a little chaotic and all over the place. I really like the pan spread around like 30% or so. Beautiful. Now here's where the quirks of the OB-6 come in. So what I'll often do is I'll have oscillator LFO1, the main LFO, just be doing vibrato. It is a shame there's not a second LFO. I talk about that in my comparison with the OB-X8. But yeah, that is one thing I still wish that the Prophet 5, Prophet 6, and OB-6 had, is just a vibrato LFO like the X8. But anyways, moving on. So my first main LFO usually does vibrato. Nice slow vibrato. And then what I'll do is I'll start to just fade in the notch variable a little bit and slowly fade in some white noise too. And this creates a pad sound that you just cannot create this any other way. The character of this brassy, plucky pad sound, I use this in so many songs. Sorry about that mistake there. That is just, listen to just totally plain and normal, still beautiful. Then we bring in this notch, and it's a sound that is unique only to the OB-6. Right? And let's do one more interesting quirk that, again, you can only do on this synthesizer. Literally nothing else in my studio can do it. And that's we're going to start using cross modulation for the normal to bandpass or the filter mode. We'll see which one sounds better. That already sounds sweet. Let's try filter mode. So filter mode, being modulated at audio rates, tends to produce a really kind of like bright, buzzy sound. Kind of like crumpling paper. And then the normal to bandpass produces this really interesting, almost like tearing sound, which is, again, just really beautiful. And these are things that are unique to the quirks and the filter section of the OB-6, being basically half Oberheim with this sem filter and half Prophet with the cross mod section, right? So. Like, what a cool sound. And again, I'm going to cut this off here. I don't want this to turn into another 45-minute long walkthrough of the OB-6 because we've already done one of those. Alright, well that's where I'm going to wrap up this video for today. Hopefully that answers all of the questions I've been getting that I still get to this day about whether the OB-6 is still worth it, whether I still have it or I sold it. I can safely say I'm never going to sell this instrument. I've been lucky enough to work with many companies in the last few years who've sent me their synthesizers to review, and I've also bought and sold many synthesizers, so I feel pretty qualified to speak on modern offerings of what's available on the market. And I can safely say, if you like the tone of the OB-6 and you don't mind the fact that it's limited like all great instruments are, then it's still, in my humble opinion, the best modern analog synthesizer money can buy in 2024. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next video, and have a great day.